Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. Would ask everyone in-house to make their last courtesy check that cell phones have been turned off. It is always appreciated. And, of course, our Internet viewers are always welcome to join by email, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org for any questions or comments at any time. We will post the program on our Heritage homepage as well for your future reference. Hosting our discussion today is Ana Quintana, Research Associate for Latin America in our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies. She earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree in Political Science at Florida International University, as well as certificates in National Security and Latin American and Caribbean Studies. Upon graduation, she studied in Brazil on a scholarship sponsored by the Defense Intelligence Agency as a foreign language and cultural studies scholar. Later, she completed a Master of Arts degree in Global Governance at Florida International at their School of International and Public Affairs. Prior to joining Heritage, Ms. Quintana worked at the Department of Defense as a student trainee for the summer of 2013. She also interned with International Relief and Development, working on Latin American rule of law issues, and with the U.S. Agency for International Development, working on civilian-military cooperation. Please join me in welcoming Ana Quintana. Ana?
Thank you, John. Greetings and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us to what promises to be an informative and thought-provoking panel discussion. I want to thank the panelists for joining us today and for preparing their remarks. And just want to clear up a few administrative things before we start. The panelists will have 10 to 15 minutes to deliver their remarks, and afterwards I'll open up the floor to the audience and our online viewers for questions. And rather than interrupt the panelists, I'd like to give you a note about their biographies. Ambassador Roger Noriega has more than 2 decades of public policy experience focusing on the U.S. interests in the Western Hemisphere. He was Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs under President George W. Bush. He was also the U.S.'s ambassador to the Organization of American States. And prior to that, he was a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee staff of Chairman Jesse A. Helms, and he also served on the House International Relations Committee of Chairman Benjamin A. Gilman. The ambassador also played a pivotal role in drafting of the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act of 1996. Prior to that, he worked in various senior capacities for USAID and the State Department. Eric Olson is the Associate Director of the Latin American program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in D.C. His research and writing has focused primarily on security issues and the impact of crime, organized crime, and violence on democracies. He has also written about U.S. drug policy and reform of police and judicial institutions. Prior to joining the Latin America program, he was the Associate Director and the Senior Security Specialist at the Wilson Center Mexico Institute for 5 years. And before joining the Wilson Center, he was a Senior Specialist in the Department for Promotion of Good Governance at the Organization of American States. Joseph Humeyer is a global security expert focusing on the nexus between security, defense, and economic freedom. He is currently the Executive Director of the Center for Secure Free Society, a global think tank based here in Washington, D.C. And prior to this, Humeyer was a Director of Institute Relations at the Atlas Economic Research Foundation and spent 7 years with the United States Marine Corps, deployed to many hotspots around the world, including Iraq and Liberia, and partook in the first multinational military exercise in Latin America, UNITAS 4504. And with that, I turn it over to the ambassador.
Thank you, Ana. Good morning, everybody. Appreciate your attendance here to talk about issues that are important to U.S. security and that are at stake in elections in Central America that are coming up in the next few months. I'm going to talk a little bit about both Honduras and El Salvador because El Salvador has elections in February. Honduras's elections are this next weekend. I think this is important for us to focus on because you see at play in these elections not only a new strain of populism, but the influence of international narcotics syndicates that have been pushed into Central America from the recent offensive by the Mexican state and have found fertile terrain in countries that, with weak states that are less capable of responding to the threat and to the lawlessness that they represent. But you also see this neo-caudillo phenomenon. These new political strongmen that are very familiar in Latin American history, but a new strain of populism also backing up that caudillismo, where you see along the Chavez model the purposeful dismantling of democratic institutions that took the greater part of the 20th century to establish or to consolidate in Central America. This is no longer merely an ideological phenomenon. Really, it wasn't, because you had caudillos of the right, the military right in Latin America's history. It's not just sort of a left-wing phenomenon along the lines of Chavez, because you see it working as part of a political project of power-hungry politicians who are seeking to profit from corruption. The new dangerous dimension in all of this, as I mentioned, is the ominous presence of organized crime in a corridor through which is moved about 90% of the cocaine that enters the United States. These new caudillos have struck a Faustian bargain with international crime syndicates, perhaps thinking if you can't beat them, join them, and particularly when these associations translate into financing for their campaigns, political truces when they're trying to govern, and even personal treasure. By deconstructing democratic institutions, debilitating political opponents, and rolling back the rule of law, these new caudillos are able to extend their grip on power, guarantee impunity and immunity from for their corruption, and establish a permissive environment for their criminal allies. That is a pretty stark assessment, I admit, but some of you may still be wondering why it should concern us. Well, of course, there's the economic opportunity for the United States, $30 billion in two-way trade with Central America that is at stake, and is at risk if Central America regresses to instability and insecurity. The impact of illegal immigration, if there's unrest in that part of the world again, which produced so many illegal immigrants in the past. The important family ties, where this is literally a concern to our neighbors here in the United States, what happens in their home countries. The vertical relationships between criminal gangs and their Central American crews, with gangs that represent an important organized crime threat on the streets of the United States. And the drug threat that costs this country about $200 billion in lost productivity and $10 billion in the costs of crime and punishment. So what's at stake for us? What's at stake for Central America? Well, obviously, the economic benefits about which I spoke go both ways. But there's also the human costs of insecurity, lawlessness, civil strife that are very important to Central Americans who remember the violence of the 1980s and the 1990s. Moreover, to fend off the bloody drug cartels that could gradually destroy these states and their societies, Central Americans need two key things very desperately. They need presidents who lead states that are actually committed to the rule of law and to confronting this criminality, and they need the material, political, and moral support of a friendly United States. And that's why these upcoming elections in Honduras and El Salvador are extraordinarily important for all of us. So let me give you a little bit of an overview of what's happening in Honduras and El Salvador, who the candidates are, what the environment is. In Honduras, the political scenario there basically included five traditional political parties, out of which only the Conservative National Party and the center-right Liberal Party have won the presidency since the establishment of a modern functional Honduran democracy in 1982. This election will feature the participation of four new political parties, including the Libre Party of former President Manuel Zelaya, which many consider has a chance of breaking the traditional monopoly on presidential politics, as well as winning many seats in the Congress. Hondurans will be electing new Congress, mayors, and municipal councils. There is one round of voting for president, with the candidate receiving the most votes winning that office, regardless of whether they receive a majority. Key candidates are Mauricio Vieira of the Liberal Party, Villeda is the son of former President Ramon Villeda Morales, who was deposed by a military coup 50 years ago and is fondly remembered by many Hondurans for his reformist and democratic approach to government. Villeda is definitely from the conservative wing of his party, and he has based his campaign on a critique of the current administration of Pepe Lobo, promising much-needed transparency and equal justice before the law. He appeals to many in the Honduran middle class who are tired of the impunity that has marked their nation's politics and government in recent years. He is lagging in third place in most political polls, and it now seems that he will not be likely to unite his base, and that he will probably lose a lot of his base to other candidates. Juan Orlando Hernandez is the National Party candidate. He is currently the president of the Honduran Congress. He has used that position to provide him significant advantage in the current race. Months before the campaign began, he pushed through a lot of controversial laws through the Congress, so many have styled him as sort of a caudillo in his own right and criticized him for that. He has bitterly attacked the Zelaya administration's abuses against democracy, and therefore the wife of Manuel Zelaya, who is the candidate of the Libre Party. Soymara Castro de Zelaya of the Libre Party. Libre, by the way, is Libertad y Refundación, refounding of the country. Castro de Zelaya has no political experience, really, and she's widely seen as an instrument of her husband's political ambitions, which were cut short by his illegal bid to hold on to power in 2009. In her campaign speeches, which have been few and far between because she's not a particularly eloquent presenter, something that maybe she and I have in common, but maybe the only thing. She says that she will refound the country based on a new constitution, a promise that is quite frankly technically banned under the current Honduran constitution to make that sort of a reform promise, and that's what brought her her husband, Manuel Zelaya, down in 2009. Under Honduran law, a new constituent assembly implies dissolving the Congress, the Supreme Court, and other institutions, as well as the current constitution, in order to set up an assembly of constituent representatives that will rewrite the country's laws from scratch. And many observers believe that Manuel Zelaya, her husband, is actually running for president of that constituent assembly. So Aymara retains an important measure of support and popularity among Honduran voters, and as a matter of fact, months ago, in most polls in the summertime, she was running neck and neck, and maybe even with a slight lead. That has changed a bit. It raised expectations certainly among her supporters, but in a series of polls released just before the October 23rd deadline for publishing polls, she was running ahead in only one of them. Juan Orlando Hernandez, the Liberal Party, National Party candidate, was running ahead in 5 of those, and Villeda was ahead in 2 of those polls. So it looks as if Hernandez, the traditional political party political machine, has kicked in and is moving public opinion in his way, which many expected. Now, Hondurans traditionally view elections as sort of a civic fiesta, an opportunity to sort of rejoice in their democracy and the fact that they have an opportunity to choose their own leaders. That's pretty common in Central America. Unfortunately, there seems to be a growing concern that the Libre Party will attempt to play a spoiler role in all of that and protest whatever the results may be. And I take a look at these. I have a couple of slides I think they'll put up here. This was just from last Sunday, where you have representatives or members of Soymara Zelaya's Libre Party attacking buses carrying nationalist activists on their way to the party's closing event in Tegucigalpa. According to police reports which were published, and you can see it for your own eyes here, Libre activists launched rocks and attacked the buses as they were passing. They clearly saw who they were because they were literally waving their flag outside the buses. This is not uncommon in Central America, but it raises some concern that you could see this kind of violence. Dr. Carlos Ponce, who is a Venezuelan political scientist who heads the Latin American Network for Democracy, says that the market on used tires has been cornered in recent months by Libre folks who intend to use them in a famous Segunda Vuelta, where they will protest by burning the tires and barricading the streets. So this is a serious concern. Now, let me just say something that's very important subtext, because it goes directly at my concern about the influence of narco-trafficking. I can confirm from 3 separate DEA agents telling me over a period of years that Manuel Zelaya is directly complicit in narco-trafficking. And several U.S. Foreign Service officers have told me the same thing. Even during 2009 crisis, people were scratching their heads, U.S. officials who said that Zelaya's association with narco-trafficking is well known, and it was absolutely ridiculous that the United States was calling for his restoration to power because he is essentially an important link in this drug chain, and which might have been why Chavez, who converted Venezuela into a narco state, was so important in having a compliant ally in power in Honduras. Despite the fact that a lot of the money from Chavez's international movement, ALBA, it may be drying up after his death, in Honduras at least. It looks like there's a lot of narco-trafficking money that's sustaining that campaign. Very quickly, what's at stake in Honduras? Well, given the very fragile environment since that 2009 crisis, this is an opportunity, these elections, to consolidate Honduran democracy and move forward, to strengthen the state, to strengthen its relationship with the United States and its neighbors. So we're very hopeful that they can make the very best of this opportunity. Turning to El Salvador, and I'll speak for maybe 3 or 4 more minutes, it's scheduled to have elections on February 2nd in 2014. Unlike Honduras, El Salvador has a second round if a majority is not elected to the presidency in the first round. In this setting, you have a party of the FMLN, which is the ruling party. They are closely associated with this ALBA international network, which has a network of commercial enterprises that operate in El Salvador and generate significant resources from the sale of petroleum and other commercial activities, whose intent was to displace private sector activity, and now it's generating revenue, and which is clearly being used to benefit the candidate of the ruling party, the FMLN. Also, the ruling party appears to be using institutions of the state to attack its opponents and to favor the FMLN candidate. The candidate of Arena is a man named Norman Quijano. He's the current mayor of San Salvador, and he has shown steady performance progress in the polls after a very weak and uninspiring start. It seems likely that he will make it to the second round. He and his primary opponent, FMLN candidate Salvador Sanchez Seren, are running neck and neck in most polls. Sanchez Seren represents unlike the current president, Mauricio Funes, a radical wing of the FMLN, which is a former guerrilla movement, which is now in politics. He is well known for being much more strident and orthodox member of that party, an admirer of Chavez and Castro. Many believe that he will make it into the second round. A very interesting candidacy, really, of all of these is the guy who's running a distant third, Antonio Saca. He is the former president of El Salvador. Literally, the last time I was in El Salvador as a U.S. official, I sat just to his left at a dinner, and across was Condoleezza Rice. And so many of us in Washington are maybe sort of surprised at the role that Saca is playing today, which is mainly one of a spoiler who is looking at ensuring that the Arena party that he used to head, which expelled him for corruption, does not win power again. And many allege, and I think there's very strong proof to this, that he has essentially a pact with the FMLN, and maybe that pact even began when he was president, to allow him to engage in corrupt deals, and then he would bleed support away from his old party, Arena, so that the FMLN would win the presidency and try to keep him out of jail. So this is not the first time this sort of phenomenon has ever occurred. For example, Arnaldo Alemán did this in Nicaragua from a pact from 1994, and that is the way, frankly, the Sandinistas, and the only way the Sandinistas made it back into power in Nicaragua was because of the pact that Alemán made that lowered the threshold for winning the presidency, and, just as important, introducing rival candidates to divide the anti-Sandinista center-right vote in Nicaragua. The same thing is sort of playing out in El Salvador today, and Saca is playing that role. One thing is clear: as long as he plays that role, I think it's fair to say that Tony Saca is not a friend of the United States today. And part of this is the troubling associations that the FMLN has and that Saca has with elements in El Salvador with the FMLN. The man here pictured with Salvador Sanchez Seren is Jose Luis Merino. Merino is infamous for his associations with the Colombian narco-trafficking FARC guerrilla movement. His association is well documented from captured laptop of the guerrilla leader in Colombia, Mono Jojoy. All of this information was turned over by the Colombian government to Saca when he was president, which should have been enough to prosecute Merino for his involvement in international narcotics trafficking and engagement with a terrorist organization. But Merino was never brought to justice. Instead, you see this man who's a facilitator of drugs and weapon shipments in Central America as essentially a business partner of Tony Saca's cousin Herbert, and through which he coordinates his associations and his activities with the FMLN. This sort of pact has manifested itself now in the persecution of Arena, former Arena government officials. Francisco Flores is a former president of El Salvador who who preceded Saca, and now you see them reaching way back into history to hold these Arena activists responsible for alleged corruption. Many people believe that this is sort of trumped up to sort of paint Arena as a corrupt political party, and it remains to be seen whether this tactic will work. In conclusion, I'll let you judge the role being played by these neo-caudillos, Manuel Zelaya and Tony Saca, in these upcoming elections, or whether they're good or bad for Central America, or for that matter for us. I hope we all can agree that in order to preserve the democratic institutions and the rule of law, and again, as I said, to fend off these bloody drug cartels, Hondurans and Salvadorans need two very important things. They need presidents who are committed to strengthening the rule of law, not evading it, and they need the political, material, and moral support of the friendly United States. And that can only happen if you have partners in these countries who are committed to building stronger democracies that can resist illegal activities and confront that narco threat with our help. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Anna, for the invitation. Always a pleasure to be here at the Heritage Foundation. We do a lot of programming at the Woodward Wilson Center, and so it's nice to just show up and do my piece and not worry about all the other stuff. So thank you for the organizing. And I see my friend Ray Walzer here, longtime Heritage Foundation employee, Director of the Latin America Program. And Roger, thank you. It's always a delight to share the podium with you. I can't hold a candle to Ambassador Noriega, but I'll do my best here to give you my sense, my read on what's going on. Anna asked me to talk about the security situation in Honduras and how it might be an issue related to the elections there. So, and in particular, the situation of organized crime. As you know, or may not, Honduras has become infamous as the country with the highest homicide rate in the world. A rate of over 85 per 100,000. Some cities have a rate of over 300 per 100,000. That's a rate higher than many countries at war. So that gives you an idea. By UN standards, any homicide rate of over 20 per 100,000 is considered epidemic violence. And Mexico, who we know is a country that's had a lot of homicides, has a national average of about 21, 22 per 100,000. High, but Honduras, unfortunately, is well over 85. So we know it's an extremely violent country, and the question is why and what's contributing to that. And I wouldn't pretend to give you a clear answer on all that now, but there's no question that organized crime and trafficking is an element in the violence in Honduras, plaguing Honduras today. Now, we immediately, when we think of this, we go to drug trafficking, and I spend a lot of time thinking about drug trafficking, so that's a logical thing. But let me just, so that we don't forget about other components of organized crime and trafficking, mention that Honduras also has a number of serious problems with trafficking in basic contraband, used clothing, coming across the region. Much of it is used clothing from the United States, and you can go to parts of San Pedro Sula or Tegucigalpa and see markets where people are reselling used clothing. Much of it that's just being brought in on buses through normal contraband. Pirated goods is also a huge problem. And the guy on the street corner, the woman on the street corner selling pirated CDs may seem innocent enough, but they're part of a network of organized crime. And so we got to keep that in mind. One that people don't think about often is the issue of trafficking in lumber and precious woods. A year ago, just about a year ago now, Interpol took down a network of lumber traffickers all over Latin America, arrested as many as 200 people, some of which were Hondurans. There is contraband in hardwoods and precious woods that takes place in the Mosquitia. Sometimes it's cut down in the Mosquitia, Nicaragua, brought across in the river systems and up through the Caribbean. But it's there, and it represents an important element of organized crime and illegal economies in Honduras. And then, of course, the tragedy, the terrific tragedy of trafficking in persons. We know that there's trafficking that originates in Honduras of young women being trafficked for sex, and young men and women being trafficked for labor. And they not only move into Guatemala and Mexico, but all the way to the United States. And that's also a very serious problem. So those things are all elements of the bigger picture. Oh, one other one, petroleum. One report last year said that Honduras lost 10% of revenue from its oil imports to organized crime, stealing of oil. That's $230, $240 million may not seem like a lot of money to the United States, but it's not insignificant in the case of Honduras. And then we haven't even touched on the big one, which is drug trafficking. And I think Roger mentioned that by U.S. estimates, as much as 87% of the drug flights and coastal boats that bring drugs up from South America stop in Honduras. Maybe as much as 80% of all cocaine leaving South America transit through Honduras at some point. It's a major, major link in the trafficking chain that goes from South America into the United States. So that's the panorama of organized crime. Not all violence in Honduras is related to it. There's also a lot of violence related to local criminal networks that are involved in distributing drugs locally, and gangs that fight for control of corners and neighborhoods. But this is all related in one way or the other to a society that has very, very weak institutions, and a government that has not been able to limit, stop, undermine, and dismantle these criminal networks, be they international networks or local criminal networks. One of the myths, of course, in Honduras that we hear repeated often is that somehow this is a recent phenomenon, that this is something that might have occurred after the crackdown in Mexico. President Calderon declared war on organized crime in Mexico, and so the narrative is that in that process, Mexican organized crime moved into Honduras, moved into Guatemala. There is evidence of some of that happening, there's no question, but organized crime has been active in Honduras for decades. The furthest back case that I have been able to identify involves an infamous Honduran drug trafficker, Ramon Mata Ballesteros, who was the link between Colombian cartels and the Caro Quintano organization in Mexico back into the 1970s. And they brought drugs into Honduras from Colombia and then shipped them north using the Mexican networks. That, of course, expanded and became much stronger in the 1980s and 90s as the U.S. and other countries began to shut down the Caribbean routes, and more of it came into Central America and Mexico. But we need to keep in mind that this is not just a phenomenon of the last 3 years or the last 6 years or the last 10 years, but really goes back quite some time. And so one of the overall points I want to make here about Honduras, a country that I lived in for 2 years and have a great deal of affinity for, is that we're not just seeing a dismantling of democratic institutions that's happened in the last few years. We are instead really seeing a failure of civilian authorities over the last 3 decades to begin to build those democratic institutions. Lost opportunities, year after year, government after government, that have failed to construct independent judiciaries, professional law enforcement, civilian institutions that can hold accountable those authorities responsible for the safety and security of Honduras itself. Now, I believe that the U.S. holds responsibility for this as well, but fundamentally, it's been a series of lost opportunities that stem back decades. And so I think one of the issues that is at stake here in Honduras is whether whomever wins is going to seriously confront not only organized crime, but the weakness in the Honduran state, making that a priority. We're running out of time? Okay. I'm just getting warmed up here. No, but let me just mention a couple areas where there have been really lost opportunity. In June of this year, I was in Honduras on a research mission, if you will, and the newly appointed Minister of Security came before Congress and reported his own sort of internal audit of the police in Honduras, the civilian police force. And I won't go into detail on everything he found, but he reported publicly that they had found that they had been paying as many as 2,000 ghost police officers. What does that mean? These are payments to people who don't actually exist. So the institution did not even know who was on its payroll. Worse than that, he reported that they only had 60-some police in 4 of the most chronically violent states in the country. Not only violent, but the entry point into Honduras for organized crime. 64 officers. So that tells me they didn't even know where they were deploying their forces. Or maybe they knew and didn't care, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt. They just didn't know. Also, he found that automobiles and vehicles that had been donated internationally for police work were missing, had been stolen. Communications equipment designed to help police do their jobs were still in their original wrappings, had never been opened, much less used. Machinery had been sabotaged. It goes on and on. And so for me, the question is, when is enough enough? When is Honduras and when is the United States going to make a bigger priority the building of civilian, transparent, and accountable institutions that can help confront these criminal organizations that are, frankly, tearing the country apart and weakening it almost on a daily basis. And I think that's got to be priority number one. A second priority, and this goes to the elections, and maybe I'll wrap up with a couple of these points, is the following. Roger rightly mentioned that there is evidence or a strong belief that criminal elements, criminal money is believed to be financing, I think you were referring to the Libre candidacy, or Libre candidate, Xiomara Castro. I really have almost no doubt about it. The problem is that that money is probably flowing to all the candidates because there is no legal requirement in Honduras to carry out an independent audit of campaign finance. The parties are required to certify and report to the tribunal their expenditures, but the tribunal has said, and they have given me in writing, there is no obligation, no legal requirement to do an independent audit of their campaign finance. So if they spent $1 million, they spent $1 million, and no one knows how they got that money, where it came from, nobody audits it. So I think the door is so wide open. The mechanisms of control and accountability are not there that one can just expect that this sort of thing is going on. If I was Chapo Guzman sitting on $30 billion or $40 billion, you can imagine how easy it would be for him to finance all of them. It's pocket change. And that's worrisome, folks. That is worrisome. It's less to me whether they're of the left or the right. The whole system lacks the transparency and accountability to guarantee and ensure the reliability of outcomes. And that's a serious problem. The second point I would make is that the tribunal, the electoral tribunal, in my estimation, has done an admirable job up to now to try to make things work and set the context for this to work. But they themselves are weak because they're essentially representatives of political parties. Many, many countries in Latin America have created electoral institutions of professionals, people who are not aligned with political parties. whose job is to be nonpartisan. And yet today, we have in Honduras an electoral tribunal made up of people representing political parties. Now, I don't say that automatically makes them bad. I would never say that. And in fact, as I said, I think they've done a relatively good job of preparing. But it calls into question, when push comes to shove, what the outcome might be and what role they might play. The last poll I saw said that an overwhelming majority, I think 2/3 of Hondurans, do not trust the process and expect some kind of fraud. So that's a serious, that's setting up a serious scenario of potential conflict. And a final point, you know, Honduras has been one of the countries, I think Roger referred to this too, that has had sort of a traditional two-party system. Nationalists were conservatives, liberals were, you know, more in the traditional sense, but liberals, pro-civilian, and they've competed over years. Well, Honduras now faces a situation post-coup in which you have, I think, as many as 9 parties competing. And while you know, opening up a political space for more competition is always a good thing, Honduras also does not have a second round in its election, so it's potentially, or it's possible and maybe probable, that the eventual victor in this process will come out with 32%, 34%, 35% of the electorate. Hardly a mandate for making any kind of important reforms that we all agree are needed in Honduras. And in all likelihood, the same will happen with control of Congress. So I think that Honduras may be headed for a difficult period ahead with no clear mandate from the people, a very divided electorate, and weak institutions. And while I have a great deal of admiration and love for Honduras, I also have a great deal of concern and worry that the scenario is potentially dangerous and difficult going ahead. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning. Thank you to my esteemed colleagues, Ambassador Noriega, Eric Olson, and of course to Ana Quintana and the Heritage Foundation. It's a pleasure to be with you. I see many friends in attendance. It's a pleasure to be amongst you. Let me put this a bit into the context of Washington and foreign policy. So my talk is actually going to be more about economics, but I want to put this in a little bit of a broader context. In June of 2009, President Obama and his administration made 2 major foreign policy blunders around the world. One is very well known to the foreign policy community and to the general public at large, and that was in Iran by not supporting civil society and the Green Revolution in June of 2009. That has led us to a situation today where we have the Ayatollahs have much more leverage and control and a sense of fear from opposition within the Islamic Republic. For those that some of you know me, I cover Iranian politics quite often. The other foreign policy blunder is obviously the point of this panel is a little closer to home, happened in Honduras when the stakes in the country, I'm referring to the constitutional crisis of 2009, stakes in the country were so high that Hugo Chavez and his geopolitical project known as the Bolivarian Alliance of the Americas set their footprint into Honduras. And unfortunately, the U.S. Foreign policy and the U.S. administration did not side against it. It's actually sided and kind of took the same position as Chavez and his allies. So that gives you a little bit of a context of where we're at. That's led us to the situation that we're at today in Honduras, where the anti-establishment has been probably the most dominant political trend in the country. Aside from all the candidates that Ambassador Noriega has mentioned, there's another candidate that's not on the ballot, but it's just as high polling, just as high as everybody else, and that's the undecideds. The undecideds are the ones that are not going to vote. That shows you that there's an apathy or an apolitical trend growing in Honduras. see if I get this right. Here you go. Ambassador Noriega covered quite eloquently, I would say, what is at stake in Honduras. So I won't go into all the candidates, but I will focus a bit on one, because there really is only one candidate that's receiving the international and at least the regional support from the regional left. You could see pictures here of the former president of Brazil, Lula da Silva, who's recently gone on TV and on social media advocating for the candidacy of Xiomara Castro from the Libre Party. You see her in pictures with Piedad Córdoba, a congresswoman from Colombia, as well as the group Foro de Sao Paulo, which is, for those that aren't acquainted, it's a political solidarity group that has political groups as well as other social movements in its fold that essentially works behind the scenes to work towards elections and to push support to different candidates that are on their ideological side. So here we have one candidate that really is receiving a lot of international support. Of the observers that are going to be going to the election this upcoming Sunday, a lot of the observers are being sent by some of these groups and some of these actors that are moving, that putting a lot of emphasis and a lot of, frankly, a lot of importance into the election of Honduras in 2009. I have here a declaration that was actually signed in June of this year that's called the Declaration of Tegucigalpa. This was written by the Foro Sao Paulo group that has a working group working in Honduras, backing the Xiomara Castro and the Libre Party. And if you look at the signatures in this document, I mean, you have signatures from people as far out as Uruguay, the Frente Amplio from Uruguay, the leftist party in that country, the Socialist Party in Venezuela, the same party that the President Nicolas Maduro belongs to, the FMLN in Salvador, that's right next, the Communist parties of Brazil, Bolivia, even Puerto Rico, and et cetera, et cetera. So the question you might want to ask is, why is all these movements, all these political parties, this coalition putting so much importance into this election? And I think what you have to understand, and this is a very important point, is that Honduras literally is at a crossroads, not just politically, but geographically. It stands at the crossroads of not just Central America, but the entire hemisphere. The best way to understand Honduras is through the lens of a cockpit. If you are going to move goods, capital, and labor, Honduras is geostrategically important for that movement. Likewise, if you're going to move more illicit projects, drugs, arms, and other people that probably are from the criminal element, Honduras is equally important. So from the lens of a cockpit, if you don't have that landing strip, that spells logistical problems, that spells geographic problems, it spells all kinds of scenarios that aren't favorable to whatever enterprise you're working in. So I think it's important to understand Honduras in a geostrategic context is very important for the international left. Ambassador Noriega mentioned Venezuela and the narco state that it's become. Well, the narco state that Venezuela has become relies on end consumers and end products that have to be moved across transnational borders. Honduras is one of those borders that it needs. Equally as important from those that are fighting illicit narco trafficking or for those that are in support of freedom and democracy in the hemisphere as a whole, Honduras is equally as important if you want to stop that threat. Because if Honduras flips, the Salvadoran elections are in February, that gives the momentum to that potentially to flip. Then you have Guatemala, and before you know it, you have Mexico, which is generally, now we're talking about North America, and then the threat becomes very close to home. So I think it's important to understand the geostrategic significance of Honduras and why the international left is coalescing around this candidate, because they need to have the political momentum to be able to carry forward their regional project, as well as for some of their more illicit sponsors need to also have that territory. But I promised I would get into a little bit of the economics, and what I want to do is dispel some of the myths that have been spoken about the Honduran economy. In June of 2009, when the constitutional crisis unfolded, one of the points that Manuel Zelaya, the former president, made when he sent a letter to President Obama was that, aside from all the illegalities that he was claiming onto the what he called the coup, he said he also was governing Honduras correctly during his term. And a lot of his stake to claim, and this has actually been a lot of the platform of the Libre Party and Xiomara Castro, is that the Honduran economy improved under his tenure. his tenure was about 2006 to mid-2009 when it got interrupted. Well, okay, there's some indicators that he can stake a claim to that. But listen, if we dig a little deeper, we have to understand what is the true situation of the economic progress in Honduras. One of the major claims that was made was that under Zelaya, Honduras had more jobs. I think it's roughly around 400,000 or maybe a little more jobs were created during the Zelaya administration. And as you can see in this graph on unemployment figures, unemployment goes down. You know, it actually started going down a little bit before Zelaya got into office, but continued to go down and drop. So yes, there were more jobs, and there was less unemployment during the Zelaya administration. That is true. But what you have to understand is that, and this is actually I like to quote one of my favorite economists, Milton Friedman, is that if your economy all that cares about is jobs, and this is in the words of Milton Friedman, said if your economy all they care about is jobs, then all you simply have to do is hire a bunch of people to dig a bunch of holes, then hire another bunch of people to fill them back up. You'll have jobs for days. But if jobs do not produce value, then the actual economic progress that your country needs to be able to create capital formation and other things so that the development takes forward won't happen. And that's essentially what we're seeing in Honduras. If we dig deep into the labor force, what we see is the labor force is generally divided into 3 blocks. You have the agricultural block, the industrial block, and the service industry, hotels, restaurant chains, tourism, and other. If you look at where the majority of the labor is composed, it's right here in the agriculture industry. Close to 40% of the labor force is concentrated in the agricultural industry. But if you look at how they produce, it's a little shy of 13%, and actually they say these figures might be a little bit high. Most people in Honduras are telling me that it's closer to 10% of actual GDP. So you have the majority of your labor force producing the least amount of value in the country. That is underemployment. So you have, obviously this picture wasn't taken in Honduras, but I actually recently went to Tegucigalpa, and I actually wish I took a picture of this, but unfortunately I didn't. I was having lunch at a restaurant on one of their major streets, and if anyone goes to Tegucigalpa, or if those are going to go for the election, you'll see there is construction everywhere. I mean, it really is. It's abundant. And I was having lunch, and I see a group of workers, I imagine construction workers, standing, and there was one of them, I guess they were washing the graffiti off a wall, and one of them was washing the wall while the other one was scrubbing. And there was about 10 people with the same gloves and equipment just standing around and watching. Now, I had about an hour and a half lunch, and you know, the scenario did not change, which shows to me that all these people were employed, but all those people productively employed. And as they're adding value to the structure of production in your country. Unfortunately not. Moreover, claim number 2, the other claim that was often made was that public debt significantly dropped under the Zelaya administration. Again, this is mostly true, although you would see this, window is a bit wider than it should be. The drop actually happened a bit before Zelaya got into office, but it is generally true there is a significant drop in public debt during the Zelaya administration. But that's attributed to some other factors that happened before Zelaya got into office. Manuel Zelaya, when he took office in 2006, he largely inherited a debt-free country because of a lot of the work that the previous administration did, lobbying to the IMF and the World Bank to be a part of a program that they initiated during the early part of the 21st century called the HIPC, the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Relief Program. So countries that are very poor, that have no possible way of paying back their debt, they forgave portions of that debt. That was the case in Honduras, so he inherited a lot of a debt-free situation, but what did he decide to do? Instead of trying to reinvest or create a labor force, create incentives, depress the inflation rate, what did he decide? He decided to go on a massive social spending spree. So while debt didn't become a problem, deficit spending did. And deficit spending grew considerably in the Zelaya administration. And it's, actually it was very hard for me to find actual figures of the amount of deficit spending. I found it in specific industries like the healthcare industry and perhaps in pensions, but I couldn't find it as an aggregate whole. But you could still see signals and signs that this is a problem, particularly if you try to get a loan. If you go to a commercial bank, the commercial lending rate is upwards of close to 18.5%, which is very high if you want to get a loan in Honduras. Most people can't afford that, therefore they don't do it. This shows you that there's a shortage in the supply of loanable funds in Honduras, which, for those that are more into the economics of it, that actually distorts the trade-off between consumption and investment, which distorts the structure of production. There's actually Honduras is having its own Obamacare moment at this given time. There's actually 670 doctors that are on strike in Honduras because they haven't been paid. And for those that have been paid, their wages haven't been adjusted to inflation. The reason they haven't been adjusted to inflation is because their wages were artificially suppressed during the moment when Mel Zelaya decided to create a lot of health expenditure, unneeded health expenditure that would suppress wages, and when the economy comes back to some level of equilibrium, those wages are no longer affordable. And so the current Honduran government can no longer pay them, and if you don't pay doctors and nurses, you'll have a problem on your hands. So that's a little bit of the period. You can see a spike in there that was spent during the 2006 to 2009 period. The final claim, I could go on, there's actually many claims, but this is, I'll with this one, and then I have a couple points I want to make, and then I won't we'll go to the Q&A. But one of the ones is that Zelaya and his administration boosted consumption. All right, and this is actually a bit awkward to me because they're not shy about admitting this. They say a lot of the consumption came from the increase in remittances, and they're very proud of this. They say remittances actually went. I wouldn't be too proud of that. But yes, remittances, as you can see, were going up before Zelaya got in office. They kind of plateaued at around 2008. Then they had the crisis, and things kind of settled out. But yes, remittances went up. That does boost consumption because people get more money. They spend it in the malls. And you can see this in Honduras. One of the most fascinating things, if you go to the country, is the amount of retail chains that are available. You have every fast food industry known to man, including their own, Pollo Campero and others. But you have McDonald's, Burger King, and people do spend. They do spend, and there is an amount of consumption that goes in the Honduran economy. But consumption is only half the battle if you don't have investment. One of the reasons that remittances go up is because migration is happening. More people are leaving your country, and that's not a good thing. So there is more money coming into your country from Hondurans that are living abroad, but that's because there's more people leaving Honduras. That means there's capital flight. That means there's a brain drain. That means some of the best leaders that potentially could reform your economy and create a path towards development are no longer there. They're choosing other options because outside of the electoral scenario that people vote for the candidate, the biggest vote that any Honduran could ever make is to vote with their feet, to move to another place, to say, I want to live a life somewhere else. And you can see the migration rates. If you parallel it to the remittances, it's completely parallel. There's a huge spike at the point exactly in the remittances at the point when people leave the country. And that's not a good thing. Remittances also do have some harmful effects towards your economy in the sense that you could think of it in the essence of less sophisticated foreign aid. So you perverse incentives in the country. So if you're think of it from a very micro level, if you're an individual and you're constantly getting a paycheck from your family member abroad, that really doesn't create the incentive to actually go and work and create your own paycheck. So there is a bit of a perverse incentive and an adverse effect to remittances in the country. And if you don't want to have your whole economy based on remittances, that's not a good thing. And there you can see, again, a little spike that correlated with the rise in remittances. And this is kind of my final point, but at the end of the day, we talked, most people know about Honduras, and I think most of the panelists talked about Honduras, is that it's the largest, it's the homicide capital of the world. It has, a plethora of gangs, transnational criminal groups, and all kinds of bad things that are going on, a lot of violence and crime. But that they view as sometimes as a cause. In reality, what I have viewed it is it's a symptom. The insecurity in Honduras is a symptom to deeper problems, institutional problems that have predated the rise and uptick in the homicide rates. This graph kind of correlates, something that the Heritage Foundation knows very well, which is economic freedom scores and homicide rates. And what you see is there's an inverse relationship. This is just a correlation. This is for those, that are really into, causation and causality. I'm not making an either-or argument. All I'm saying is there's a direct correlation. And you can make this correlation in just about any country that has a high levels of crime and violence. Usually you're going to see a trend line that inverses in a pattern that crosses like this. So while the sharp uptick in homicide rates, Honduras' is long-standing low levels of economic freedom never improved. It stayed the same, if not suppressed a little bit. And I think that's at the heart of what we're getting at when we talk about what are the problems in the country. Because at any given moment in society, you have two industries or two enterprises that work parallel. So I'll say that again, you have two enterprises that work parallel. On one end, you have a formal enterprise, or what we like to call the free enterprise, And on the other hand, you have an informal enterprise, and at the worst level, you have the illicit enterprise or the criminal enterprise. When incentives, which is the most basic of all economics, and when the incentives are greater for predation, criminal enterprise, than production, free enterprise, you tend to get a criminal state. And that's what we're seeing in Honduras. It's not that, you saw the migration rates. It's not that Honduras has a special visa for criminals and they're just importing them from all over the country, although there is some bad actors coming in. No, they're converting people into criminals. And you're converting people into criminals because the activities, whether it's extortion, crime, drugs, gangs, or what have you, are becoming rentable activities that people think the risk outweighs the benefits, the rewards outweigh the risks. And so I want to conclude with this and to say that Honduras is not only facing a crisis of insecurity, Honduras is facing a crisis of lack of liberty. And until the country understands that, and until all the actors that want to help Honduras understand that, I believe we're going to continue to see the same symptoms play out over and over again. Thank you with your time.
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you all for your remarks. With that, I want to open it up to the floor for questions. I ask that you state your name and the organization you're affiliated with, and also if you could please keep the question in question form and not make any statements. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Sofia, and I'm a Honduran citizen. And I know that, or everyone else know that it's for public acknowledgement that the narco traffic in Central American region is a big issue. And my question goes directly to Ambassador Roger Noriega. And I would like to know, which do you believe is the best candidate and who will tackle the problem best on narco traffic issues and have more effective policies to tackle this issue?
Well, thank you very much for the question, and I think we would all agree that this is, with your premise, that it's an important challenge. But I'm going to refrain from saying who would be the best. I might very well be interpreted as who would be the worst, but I'll leave that to you. But I think an important way to reflect on this, on your question, is the nuance and history that Eric shared. The failure of the political class over time to build the institutions and build a transparent government, a representative Congress, a strong judiciary, a professional police force, an accountable president, that sort of institutionalized democracy that becomes the bulwark against this kind of criminality. And it's interesting to me, I think maybe Vieda talks a little bit about the rule of law, transparency more than the others. But I don't, I think at this point it hasn't been, from what my impression is, hasn't been sort of a issues-oriented campaign in many respects. And maybe that's the reason there's so many people who remain undecided. But I think if you don't mind, I think I'd refrain from saying who would be the best. Maybe Eric has some
No.
comments, not endorsements.
No.
Thank you, Ray Walser, formerly of Heritage, currently with the Americas Forum. Ambassador Noriega or Eric, I saw you yesterday at the Secretary of State's speech. Interesting, this was an opportunity to sort of lay out U.S. foreign policy. He proclaimed the death of the Monroe Doctrine, which I thought we had buried long ago, but that was sort of the main headline yesterday. In his speech, in U.S. policy, could you draw anything out? He called for free and fair elections in Honduras, but then sort of stepped away from, talked about citizen security. Is there anything new that we saw in this speech or anything new that the administration can be doing at this particular juncture with regard to Honduras and Central America?
Were you directing that to Roger?
Well,
Why don't we give some-
Eric, I saw you were there. I don't know if Roger was there.
I wasn't there.
That's a good question. I think, in the discussion after the speech, there was a sense, I had a sense that Secretary Kerry did a good job of confirming the broad parameters of U.S. policy over the last, since 2008. I didn't get a strong sense that he broke any real new ground, other than his, somewhat impassioned discussion of climate change being an important factor. But that's another topic for another day right now. He restated again the commitment to and the importance of working on democracy, a commitment to the Democratic Charter, all those things that I don't mean this dismissively, but have been part of the talking points of this administration and previous administrations. But the question that those of us who watch this is, what concretely are you going to do? Where beyond the platitudes that we all agree on, democracy is at the core of this, and we have to build it. Where are you willing to invest some political capital to ensure that actually happens? And I'm not as, I didn't come away really clear about that. I think they're he referred specifically to the election in Honduras and the importance of that. But I guess I would like to have a little bit harder nose approach to this issue of democracy and transparency and accountability. I think, and this is not a partisan statement, I think successive U.S. administrations have been willing to continue to fund things when it's clear that the money is fungible, that it's not producing the results we want, all those sorts of things. And I think obviously the countries that receive the money have to be held responsible, but U.S. Administrations also have to look at themselves in the face and say, are we just kind of continuing to pay lip service to ideals that we all share, but don't have any real outcomes for it? And we've been supporting judicial reform in Honduras, am I right, since the 1970s or 80s? And we're talking during Republican administrations and Democratic administrations. I'm for judicial reform, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that we don't need it. I'm just saying we just keep doing the same thing, and there's nothing that, nothing changes. In fact, it changes for the worse rather than for the better. So, I wasn't, what he had to say was right, but we, kind of want a different approach that makes it more of a reality. That was my take.
Good. I will comment on this. Not surprisingly, look, the Monroe Doctrine wasn't the right of the United States to intervene in Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine, which is ancient, spoke to European countries mucking around in the Western Hemisphere after the 1820s. So, sure, we gave it a decent burial yesterday. And no better place to bury things than at the OES, which is a graveyard for ideals today, and has become one under this administration. And so it's poignant that he left the building with one fewer doctrine, orienting U.S. engagement in the Americas. Not to be too sharp, too sharply critical, but the U.S. is just not present in the Americas. And we had not just talking points, but doing points, not only in the administration I was a part of, but the one before. The Clinton administration conceived of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. We committed to signing it. President Bush before did NAFTA. President Clinton got it done and implemented it. We had Central American trade And it wasn't just about commerce. We also made democracy and human rights an essential part of the strengthening of institutions, and which make for stronger market economies and better economic partners. So we had a vision. And even when we were doing other things in the world that preoccupied us, and it's some things that divided us from our friends in the Americas, we still had a level of engagement in the region that you just do not see today. And, you know, the Inter-American Democratic Charter is a dead letter. I literally am the person who signed that for the United States on September 11, 2001. It's a dead letter. It was an extraordinarily auspicious statement where a hemisphere committed to representative democracy as an organizing principle. And it was buried at a General Assembly in Honduras. And Manuel Zelaya presided at the funeral when they had readmitted Cuba, right? And then 8 months later, he's pleading for the invocation of the Inter-American Democratic Charter to defend his own Caudillo personal interests. And we went along with that. So, I mean, I have to say that the learning curve and the engagement curve by this administration is as flat as the Kansas plains. And I'm from Kansas, and I know flat.
Can I just add two small points, and certainly not to get into a back and forth with Roger. I will say that the administration on Honduras, in my opinion, has taken the right position, which is we're not gonna choose a winner here. We're going to work with whomever and try to make sure that the focus is on the types of things that we've been discussing, which is the rule of law, building institutions, and public safety and security. I know that, I know that's not the popular position, but I fundamentally believe that's the right one. And then, what was my second point? I forgot it. Oh, well. It'll come in.
I just make one quick point. I didn't see the Secretary of State, Secretary Kerry's speech, but, and this is going to be a little bit outside of policy, which I think was your question, Ray, but I've heard the institutions being brought up over and over again, that's needed, is critical, and a way to support Honduras is to help build institutions, but I think we have to clarify or distinguish a little bit. There's formal institutions, which are government institutions that need to be reformed, and, you know, judicial, police, military, others, but there's also informal institutions, and many times the informal institutions drive what the formal institutions, or the makeup of those formal institutions. One is civil society, and I think one of the things that's been very absent in Honduras is the presence of a civil society. If you look at reforms from like a tier level, right? At the highest level, you could have ideas. Below ideas, you would have policy. Below policy, you would have some advocacy. Well, Honduras has a lot of advocacy and some policy, but very ambiguous ideas of how they want to reform the country. And if you look at the isthmus, the northern triangle within the isthmus, one of the countries, I think that it also has problems and potential threats, but has been able to deal with it a little bit better, is Guatemala. And if you look at Guatemala civil society, you know, universities like Francisco Marroquin, groups, other civil think tanks, and other NGOs have been able to move the climate of public opinion so that they're not as susceptible to populist threats. So I think one of the things that the U.S. wants to get involved and support in any way would be to help boost or create or enhance the civil society in the country.
Thank you. I'm Joel Mandelman with the Civil Rights Working Group here at the Foundation. I was wondering if any of you could comment on why we've been at this, 40, 50 years, these elites have never been able to develop these institutions, or is the problem that they really don't care as long as they've got theirs, they're not worried about what's going on next door? Or what has prevented the development of all the institutions that all of you have talked about that, you know, would be essential to developing civilized society?
I could take a first crack at it. I'm a bit biased when I say this, but you know, I think education is an area that's severely in deficit in Honduras, and I have some friends from Honduras here in attendance. I don't want to, you know, demean Hondurans, but there is a very lack of just good ideas in Honduras. There's a lot of good actors, a lot of smart businessmen, there's a lot of smart politicians, there's a lot of smart lawyers and engineers and others, but really when you kind of try to wrap it up into some type of coherent framework, it's a bit absent. When I say I was biased, I was referring to economics. You can see my presentation. I'm an economist by my academic training. If you want to learn economics, there isn't many places to go in Honduras. You probably have to go to Costa Rica or maybe to Marroquín in Guatemala or some other university. There isn't a clear understanding of how economics work in Honduras. There's a good understanding of how business works, which is very different from economics. If you want to understand how supply and demand works in a macro framework, how a structured production actually is supposed to be able to boost your economic growth so that you have sustainable development over time, you need to understand the basics of economics. And I think that's just I cherry picked one, and that's one that I have obviously a bias for. But these are the kind of things that are in deficit in the country, and they're sorely needed. I mean, someone that would create a good economic. I think there's like maybe one or two economic programs, and they're usually at the state universities, and they're not taught very well. If someone would create some, private universities that might be able to do this education, you don't have to wait for the government. It could happen in the private sector. It could happen through private universities. I think that would be a good step in the right direction.
Well, I hasten to note that the Hondurans have done probably a better job in certain ways over the last 60, 80 years in terms of developing a middle class and politically conscious people and functioning political parties and functioning institutions. And they've made a lot of mistakes over time and there's sort of an exploitive economic model that the United States was an essential part of, quite frankly, and sustaining sort of structural poverty over time. But they're pulling out of these things, and I think it's very poignant that in 2009 they rose up a lot of Hondurans across the political spectrum from all walks of life to say Zelaya was mugging our Constitution, and our Supreme Court, our Attorney General, our electoral authorities, our Congress all said that he forfeited his right to continue as president. And the United States joined a clique of other countries to intervene in their internal affairs and try to jam Zelaya down their throat. So they spent all these decades trying to build democratic institutions, and when those institutions said that this guy was disqualified himself from office, we said, shame on you, and applied economic sanctions and denied anti-drug assistance and made them more vulnerable to narco-traffickers. And so I think that we have to be careful about sitting in judgment of where Hondurans are today, because right now all they want to try to do is get things right with the international community, get their economies going again. And I agree that some of the things that Joseph said, more investment in education over time and building a healthier market economy will generate the kinds of jobs that will build a middle class and a healthier middle class. But right now they need solidarity from people who want to help them get things right. But I think that they have a lot of people of goodwill across the political spectrum who realize that they have political power, and hopefully they will use it in the elections on Sunday.
Irina Kimushkina, consultant with Global Health Advisors on political and social issues. I have one question to our distinguished speakers. It's what do you think about women participation in upcoming elections in Honduras and in El Salvador? And I have a question for Joseph. I would like to know your opinion. Why for these years you showed low performance in agriculture? Could it be explained by most migration in rural areas of Honduras to the city or to some other countries abroad. And that means that most women are doing agriculture in this country.
Okay, I'll answer your first question, and then I'll go to the second. That's a very good point, actually. Some of the demographics that I've looked at and for this electoral scenario, there are two big constituencies that may determine the election and are definitely making an impact. One you mentioned is women. It's the women in Honduras is I don't know the exact percentage, but it's a large majority. It's worth paying attention to. I think that might be some of the support that Xiomara Castro has been able to consolidate and bring towards her favor. And the other is the youth. Honduras is a very young country. The median age is in the young 20s. So it's a country that the youth is playing an important role as well in the trajectory that the country will take. As far as what the impact will make, I think they'll definitely make an impact. I'm not sure exactly which direction or which candidate they prefer. The fact is, Xiomara Castro is a woman. I'm sure that somewhat plays in her favor, but couldn't tell you with any type of certainty. As far as the agricultural statistics, my major point was that you have an underemployed labor force. It's not necessarily that the agriculture is not productive. It may very well be productive. A lot of the exports from Honduras come from the agricultural sector, bananas and other. So that doesn't mean that it's not being used in a way that adds value to the international economy, because obviously it is. There's a comparative advantage levels, scales that people use those goods and services for their own consumption. But internally, and this is just kind of like if you look at a traditional structure of production, you try to go from, a country that produces more raw materials to a country that produces more intermediate goods to eventually a country that produces consumer goods that can actually be consumed in your own country. So you don't have to import that. That's why one of the reasons Latin America clothing is so expensive, because most of it's imported. If Latin America could develop that sector, I mean, that's just an example, the prices would accommodate. So my main point with the agriculture is that it's not that it's inefficient, it's not that it's not adding value to the world's economy, it's that it's underemployed. There's oversupply of labor in the agricultural field, which is why I think you have a lot of people actually leaving the country to look at agricultural farmers that leave the country because they can't find a job, even though there's plenty of agricultural jobs. They still can't find a job in the Honduran labor force, so they go move to other parts, Mexico, and then eventually up to the United States to find that same kind of work in another country. And I think that's depicted because you have I'm not sure, we have individuals from the private sector in Honduras here probably could tell better, but I'm sure the Honduran agriculture sector probably has some level of subsidies as well, perhaps, which usually that's the symptom that you see when you see this kind of distortion in the labor markets. You see some level of government intervention, and to that degree, if there is some type of subsidy, then what you're seeing is Honduras concentrating the benefits of that agricultural production and dispersing the costs amongst the Honduran people.
Just a couple points. I don't have the numbers in front of me, I apologize, but Honduras has the highest rate of women head of household in Central America, very high rate of women head of household. Could be a variety of explanations of why that is. Maybe migration is one of them. There's also a very high rate when you try to disaggregate causes of homicide in Honduras. It's not as high as others, but domestic violence is a very high factor in homicides in Honduras. So women clearly carry a big role, carry a big burden, and suffer significant violence at home in Honduras. So public policies that address that issue would be really important. Back to this issue of the elites in the country. When I lived there, got to know a furniture maker. If you've ever been to Honduras, they're famous for their wood furniture. And this guy had a little shop, furniture maker, and he said to me one time, "Las leyes son para los pobres." Laws are for poor people. His opinion was the rich, don't aren't subject to the same rules of the game that we are as poor, struggling Hondurans. If you look at the polling data that just came out recently from Latino Barometro, 44% of Honduras support democracy. That's at the bottom, not the lowest number, but it's in the bottom 4 or 5, no question. So there's a crisis of confidence in the institutions of government. People don't believe the government is fair, treats them fairly. They don't trust in the so-called democracy because they haven't seen it work. And that's a serious problem for the country. And so I think it's time for the elites, all Hondurans and the international community wake up to this reality, that what's come before has not served the people well. And people, as Roger said, are tired of impunity. And I think it's time for some change. I'm not advocating Mel Zelaya's form of change, but change is clearly needed to solve these problems. And I think that that's got to be at the core of what comes next in Honduras.
All right, well, we've reached the end of our time. I want to thank you all for joining us. An extra special thank you to our folks from the Honduran Embassy. And please join me in thanking the panelists for their remarks.